The day they fired me for theft, I looked my manager in the eye and said nothing. 5 years later, I walked back into that same building with a signed ownership agreement in my hand, and the man who framed me could barely breathe. My name is Claire, and if you had seen me 5 years ago, standing in the middle of a crowded office with security beside me, you would have thought I was the guilty one. That was the day my life broke in public. Not in a small way, not in a quiet way. It broke in front of everyone I worked with, everyone I trusted, and the one man who claimed he was just protecting the company. His name was Richard Vale. He was my manager, and he was stealing from the company the entire time. But back then, I did not know that. Back then, I was just a hardworking employee at a mid-sized company called Harrington Supply Group in Chicago. I was 26 years old, quiet, serious, and proud of my work. I was not the loudest person in the room. I was not the kind of woman who fought for attention. I was the kind of woman who stayed late, checked every number twice, answered emails after dinner, and believed that hard work still meant something. I was in operations and account support. I handled vendor invoices, order tracking, payroll corrections, and monthly reports. It was not glamorous, but I loved the structure of it. I loved knowing that if I did my job well, everything else ran smoother. And for a while, that was enough. Richard noticed me early. At first, I thought that was a good thing. He praised my work in meetings. He said I was sharp. He said I was one of the few people who actually cared. He gave me more responsibility than the others. I stayed late to help him finish reports. I thought I was building trust. I was not building trust. I was becoming useful to him. The first sign that something was wrong came in the 4th month after I joined his team. I was checking a stack of invoices when I found a duplicate payment to a vendor called Northline Logistics. The same invoice number, the same amount. 2 payments, 1 week apart. I printed the records and went to Richard's office. He leaned back in his chair, smiled at me, and said, "Good catch, Claire. Flag it, and I'll handle it." I remember feeling proud. I thought I had found an honest mistake before it became a problem. But after that, I kept seeing strange things. Rounded numbers, fake vendor names, rush payments with no supporting documents, old invoices altered and re-entered. And every time I raised a question, Richard had an answer. "Don't worry about that one. It was already approved. You're overthinking it. Just stay in your lane, Claire." The words were always calm. That was the dangerous part. He never sounded angry. He sounded like a man who was teaching me how the business worked. I should have pushed harder. I should have gone to HR. I should have documented everything and protected myself. But I was young, and I believed that good work would protect me. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon in November. Cold outside. Gray sky. The office lights were too bright, the kind that make everything look tired. Richard called me into his office and closed the door behind me. There was a file on his desk. He did not invite me to sit down. He pointed at the file and said, "Do you know what this is?" I said, "No." He slid it toward me. Inside were bank transfer records, screenshots of emails, and a printed report showing a transfer of company funds into a private account. My name was on the authorization trail. My stomach dropped. I looked at him and said, "These are fake." He gave me a look that was almost pity. He said, "Claire, I gave you a chance. I really did." I stared at him. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out another paper. Then he put it in front of me. It was a termination notice. He said I had been immediately suspended pending investigation for theft, falsification of records, and violation of company trust. I felt like the room had tilted. I said, "Richard, this isn't true." He leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. That sentence still lives in my body. Don't make this harder than it has to be." I remember my hands shaking. I remember trying to read the papers, but seeing nothing because my eyes were full of tears. I remember asking him who else knew. He said, "Security has been informed." And then, like he had planned it all very carefully, he pressed the office line and told HR to send someone up. Within 10 minutes, 2 security guards were standing beside me. People in the hallway looked through the glass. I could feel their eyes on me. Whispers started immediately. "That girl stole." I always knew something was off. She seemed too quiet. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the papers apart and drag Richard's lies into the light. But when you are standing in that kind of humiliation, your voice can disappear. It feels like your own mouth no longer belongs to you. I was escorted to my desk to collect my personal things. I still remember every detail of that desk. The cracked pen holder, the coffee stain on the left corner, the little plant I had been trying to keep alive for months. My coworker Jenna stood frozen near the printer, with tears in her eyes. She did not know what to say. No one knew what to say. Richard watched from his office window with his hands folded neatly in front of him like a respectable man. I left the building carrying a cardboard box, a ruined reputation, and a silence that followed me home. That night, my mother sat at the kitchen table and cried. My father had passed away years earlier, and my mother had already been struggling with medical bills. My job was helping us stay afloat. Losing it meant losing everything. She asked, "Did you do it?" I looked at her and said, "No." She believed me. That was the only thing holding me together. For the next several weeks, I did everything wrong because I was desperate and heartbroken and exhausted. I called HR. I asked for a copy of the investigation. They said it was internal. I emailed accounting. No response. I hired a cheap lawyer I could barely afford. He told me there was not enough evidence to fight without access to the company records. But the company had already closed the door on me. The industry closed its doors too. My name spread. Not everywhere, but enough. In a small circle of employers, I became the girl who stole. Nobody said it directly. They just stopped calling me back. Interviews ended quickly. Background checks became a problem. One place told me I was not a good fit. Another said they had chosen another candidate. I knew the truth. I carried my shame into every room. I took part-time bookkeeping work. I packed groceries. I worked weekends at a local cafe. I cleaned office spaces at night. My mother's medication costs kept rising. Some weeks I had to choose between gas and food. I hated what Richard had done to me, but I hated more that I had no power to stop it. Then, something happened that changed the shape of my life. My Aunt Nora called me one evening and said, "Claire, I have something you need to see." She was the practical one in our family. Sharp, straightforward, the kind of woman who notices details other people miss. She told me to come over. When I got to her apartment, she handed me a folder. Inside were old printed emails, financial statements, and notes she had collected after speaking to someone who used to work in the same building as me. She said, "Richard was doing this before you were fired, and he's still doing it now." I looked through the pages slowly. Vendor overpayments, shell companies, duplicate reimbursements, missing inventory tied to the same internal approval chain, and every path led back to Richard. I felt something inside me move for the first time in years. Not happiness, not relief, purpose. Nora said, "You were not crazy, Claire. You were the cleanup." That sentence changed my life. The company had used me like a shield. They had needed someone to bury the truth, and I had been the easiest person to sacrifice. That night I made a decision. I was not going to spend the rest of my life being the version of myself they had created. I was going to become the person who could prove them wrong. So I started over. I enrolled in accounting certification classes at night while working days. I learned forensic bookkeeping. I learned audit trails. I learned how fake vendors were created. how duplicate payments were hidden, how managers misuse trust when no one checks the numbers closely enough. I kept every assignment. I kept every note. I stayed awake until 2 in the morning studying cases and spreadsheets. There were nights I cried from exhaustion. There were nights my mother told me to stop pushing so hard. But every time I wanted to quit, I remembered that office hallway. I remembered the security guards. I remembered Richard's voice. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I was determined to make it very hard. 5 years passed. By then, I was no longer the frightened girl who had been dragged out of a building with a cardboard box. I had become a consultant in financial compliance and audit support. Small businesses hired me to clean up records, find leaks, and build systems that protected them from internal theft. I was good at it because I understood the mind of a liar. And I was very, very good at numbers. One afternoon, I got a call from an investment group in New York. They were acquiring a controlling interest in Harrington Supply Group, my old company, my old nightmare. The caller said they needed someone to review the books before finalizing the purchase. I almost laughed. Then I asked the name of the lead buyer. The name was Daniel Harrington, the founder's son. The original family had not been fully involved in the company for years. Daniel had spent the last decade building his own portfolio and was now buying back control from the board after seeing financial instability. He wanted a complete forensic audit. He wanted truth, and he wanted it fast. I remember sitting very still after that call, because for the first time in 5 years, I had a way back in. Not as an employee, not as a victim, as the person with the power to open every drawer, read every file, and ask every question Richard had spent years avoiding. When I walked into that building again, the air felt different. The lobby was still polished. The glass walls were still there. The reception desk still had the same fake-friendly smile. But this time, I was not carrying a box. I was carrying a leather folder, a tablet, and a signed consulting agreement. The receptionist looked up and said, "Can I help you?" I smiled politely and said, "Yes, I'm Claire. I'm here for the audit." She checked the guest list. Then she froze. "Claire?" I nodded. She looked at me carefully, like something was trying to click into place. And then I saw it. Recognition. The office was smaller than I remembered, or maybe I was simply larger now. Stronger. Cooler. More centered. I walked past the same corridor where I had once been humiliated. This time, people looked at me with curiosity instead of judgment. In the conference room, Richard was already waiting. Older now, fatter around the middle, his hair thinner, his smile still too confident. He stood when I entered and said, "Well, this is a surprise." He looked at me like he was trying to remember where he had seen me before. Then his smile tightened. He knew. Maybe not all of it at first, but enough to feel danger. I set my folder on the table and took my seat. "Richard," I said, calm and professional, "I'll be leading the review of accounts payable, vendor records, and internal approvals." He gave a short laugh. "Claire, right? I didn't realize Daniel was bringing in such junior talent." I looked at him and said, "You'll be surprised how much junior talent can find." That was the first crack in his face. The audit began that day, and the numbers started talking. At first, the pattern was small. A vendor payment here, a reimbursement there, a mismatch in inventory valuation. Then the pattern widened. Fake vendors had been created using names similar to real suppliers. Invoices were being duplicated with altered dates. Payments were being split into smaller amounts to avoid automatic review. Some vendor accounts were linked to a private mailing address 2 towns away from Richard's home. I found payment cycles that matched his vacation schedules. I found expense reports with identical handwriting under different employee names. And then I found the transfer chain. It was clean enough to pass casual review, dirty enough to destroy a company. I sat in the records room late one night, surrounded by files and scanned reports, and I smiled for the first time in years. Not because it was funny, because it was real. I finally had proof, but I did not rush. That was the difference between the old Claire and the new one. The old Claire would have shouted. The new Claire built the case. For 3 weeks, I worked quietly. I copied the records. I mapped the transactions. I compared timestamps, approval logs, and edited documents. Richard noticed I was asking more questions. He started appearing in the records room with fake concern. He said, "You know, this company has a lot of history. Be careful not to misunderstand things." I looked up from my laptop and said, "History is exactly what I'm reviewing." He smiled, but his eyes had changed. He was worried now. Good. Then I reached the part that made everything collapse. There was a set of intercompany transfers hidden under a consulting expense category. It appeared to be legitimate at first, but when I traced the money flow through 3 shell accounts, every path came back to a company Richard had quietly registered under his wife's cousin's name. He had been stealing for years. Not hundreds, not thousands. Millions. My hands were steady when I printed the records. That surprised even me, because when I had been fired, I had imagined revenge as anger. But real power is not loud. Real power is calm. I requested an emergency meeting with Daniel Harrington and the board. Richard tried to cancel it. He said I was too new to request direct presentation time. Daniel ignored him. The day of the meeting, the room was full. Board members, legal counsel, finance staff, Daniel at the head of the table. Richard sat with his usual confidence, tapping a pen against the table as if he owned the air in the room. I placed my folder on the table. Daniel nodded to me. "Miss Bennett," he said, "please continue." I began with the basics. Vendor discrepancies, duplicate invoices, missing approvals. I showed them the logs, then the account links, then the shell companies, then the private transfer pathways. As I spoke, Richard's face started changing. At first, confusion, then anger, then fear. When I projected the ownership trail of the shell accounts on the screen, the room went silent. I looked at Richard and said, "This account was used to route payments from company funds into a private holding structure. The registered contact information matches your external address records." He stood up so fast, his chair scraped the floor. "That is a distortion," he snapped. I turned to the next slide. "It isn't. And this is the same method used to create the false authorization trail that framed me 5 years ago." That hit the room like a dropped glass. Richard's head turned slowly toward me. For the first time since I had known him, he had no answer. Daniel looked at him and said, "Did you frame her?" Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "I was protecting the company," he said finally. I almost laughed. Instead, I said, "You stole from it." The legal counsel asked for time to review the materials. Daniel was already reading the documents in front of him. His expression changed with every page. Then he looked up. "Get him out of this room." Richard exploded. He accused me of revenge. He accused me of fabrication. He accused Daniel of being manipulated. He shouted that I had no proof. But the proof was everywhere. It was in the logs, the addresses, the signatures, the transfer routes, the overwritten records, and finally, the email chain. That was the final piece. An internal message from Richard to another executive sent 2 days before my firing reading, "If Claire keeps digging, create a reason to remove her." He had planned it. He had needed me gone because I was getting too close. When the board saw the email, the room changed completely. Richard stopped talking. The legal team took over. He was placed on administrative hold that same afternoon. 2 days later, federal investigators were brought in. And then the company began to unravel. In the best possible way, the truth spread. The old reporting structure was exposed. Several executives were forced out. The company launched a full internal reform under new ownership. Daniel personally offered me a permanent role as Director of Financial Integrity and Audit Oversight. I remember staring at him for a moment because I had not expected that. He said, "You saved this company from itself." I told him, "No, I just told the truth long enough for it to matter." He smiled. "That counts." But the most important moment came later. Not in the boardroom, not in the headlines, not in the legal reports. It came in the hallway outside the old records office, the same hallway where I had once stood with security at my side. Richard was being escorted out under supervision. He saw me standing there and stopped. For a second, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He said quietly, "You waited." I met his eyes and said, "No, I healed, learned, and came back prepared." He had nothing else to say, and I realized then that revenge is not always about destruction. Sometimes revenge is just survival with evidence. Sometimes it is returning to the place that tried to erase you and proving with total calm that you were never the problem. That night, I went home to my mother and hugged her for a long time. She cried. I cried, not because I was still hurt. I was. But because the hurt no longer owned me. The company eventually settled the investigation, reimbursed the missing funds, and overhauled its entire compliance system. Richard faced criminal charges. Several others lost their positions. The people who had once looked away were forced to look directly at what silence had helped create. And me? I kept my head down and did the work. I built new systems. I trained staff. I made sure no one under me would ever be thrown away the way I had been. Sometimes new employees asked me why I was so strict about record checks and approval trails. I would smile and say, "Because numbers don't lie. People do." And I meant it. A few months later, Jenna, the coworker who had cried in the hallway when I was fired, found me in the cafeteria. She looked nervous, like she thought I might hate her. She said, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up." I studied her face and saw the same fear I had once lived with. I said, "I know." She started crying. I told her, "Next time, speak, even if your voice shakes." She nodded. That moment mattered to me more than the board meeting, because justice is not only about punishing the guilty. It is about teaching the quiet that silence can be broken. There is something people do not tell you about being vindicated after betrayal. They always imagine it feels like a movie ending. They think the music swells, the bad person gets punished, and the victim finally smiles like the pain never mattered. But real life does not end like that. Real life is quieter. Real life means you wake up the next morning with the same scars, the same memories, and the strange new problem of learning how to live after you have already survived something that almost destroyed you. That was my life after the audit. The first week after Richard was removed, the company moved like a building after an earthquake. Everyone was pretending to be calm, but you could feel the fear in the walls. People who had ignored the truth suddenly wanted to talk about culture and accountability. People who had stayed silent for years now spoke in careful, polished sentences as if they had always cared. I understood them more than I wanted to. Fear makes cowards out of decent people, but silence helps thieves. That was the lesson I had learned the hard way. Daniel called me into his office on a Friday morning, 3 days after the board meeting. He closed the door, sat across from me, and placed a folder on the desk. Inside was my new contract, a full-time leadership position, a salary that would have once felt impossible to me, health benefits, authority over compliance review, audit procedures, and internal reporting. I did not touch the paper right away. I just looked at it. Daniel watched me with patience. Then he said, "You don't have to say yes today." I finally lifted my eyes. "You're giving me a lot of trust after one audit. He folded his hands together and said, "No, I'm giving you trust because you survived what should have broken you, and you still came back with the truth." I swallowed hard. That was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in years. I asked him, "Why did you really hire me?" He did not pretend. He said, "Because the moment I saw your report, I knew two things. One, you were right. And two, anyone who could be erased and still come back that strong was exactly the kind of person this company needed." I signed the contract that afternoon. When I walked out of his office, I did not feel powerful. I felt something better. I felt steady. For years, my life had been built on survival. Work enough to pay the bills. Sleep enough to keep going. Smile enough so people would not ask questions. Now, for the first time, I had space to breathe. And that is when the memories started coming back more clearly. Not just the firing, not just the humiliation, everything. The day I first found the duplicate invoice, the times Richard dismissed my concerns, the way he always seemed to know what was happening before everyone else did, the way he used calm words like a knife hidden in velvet. I began to understand that people like Richard do not become dangerous in one day. They become dangerous because too many people let them keep going. And that truth made me angry. Not the loud kind of angry. The cold kind. The kind that changes how you see the world. For a few weeks, I had to work closely with the internal legal team and federal investigators. They wanted timelines, names, records, context. I gave them everything. Every email I had saved, every handwritten note, every memory that could be verified. And in the middle of all of it, they found more than they expected. Richard had not acted alone. That was the part that hurt the most. There were people above him who had seen signs and chose not to ask questions. There were finance managers who benefited from his clean numbers. There were executives who enjoyed the illusion of profit more than they cared about where the money came from. No one wanted to be the person who asked too much. So, they let him build a system around himself. One lie at a time. One fake approval at a time. One silent witness at a time. When the truth came out, some of them acted shocked. I was not shocked. I had worked in that building long enough to know that many people love honesty only when it does not cost them anything. The company called an all-staff meeting 2 weeks later. I almost did not go, but I did. I stood in the back of the room while Daniel addressed everyone directly. He admitted the company had failed. He admitted there had been fraud. He admitted there had been internal negligence. He did not try to paint it pretty. That mattered. Then he introduced me. "This is Claire Bennett," he said. "She uncovered what others ignored, and she deserves more respect than this company gave her the first time." The room was silent. I could feel eyes on me from every direction. Some people looked ashamed. Some looked relieved. Some looked scared. I did not speak right away. Then I stepped forward. My hands were steady. My voice was calm. "I worked here once before," I said. "I was accused of stealing, fired, and escorted out in front of everyone." That accusation was false. The real theft was happening above me, and I was the one who got blamed because it was easier than telling the truth. No one moved. I continued. "Some of you knew something was wrong. Some of you didn't. But every company is built on one thing before it is built on profit. It is built on trust. Once that trust is poisoned, everything else starts to rot." I paused. "If you see something wrong here now, speak. Do not stay quiet just because it feels safer. Silence protects the wrong people." My voice did not shake, but inside, I was shaking. Because I was not speaking only to them. I was speaking to the version of me that had stayed quiet in Richard's office years ago because I thought being polite would save me. I wish I could say I had always been brave. I was not. I had simply reached a point where fear no longer worked. After that meeting, people started treating me differently. Not all at once. Some with respect, some with curiosity, some with the kind of cautious distance people keep from a woman who has already survived a fire. I accepted all of it, because I was not there to be liked. I was there to make sure the truth had a permanent seat at the table. A few months passed. The company changed. Slowly, but truly. New systems were installed. Approval chains were tightened. Vendor audits became routine. Anonymous reporting channels were created and actually monitored. Department heads were forced to document expenses properly. It was boring work to some people. To me, it was justice with paperwork, and I loved every minute of it. One afternoon, I was reviewing a fresh set of invoices when Jenna knocked on my office door. I looked up and saw her standing there with a folder in her hands. She was nervous, like she had been the day I was fired. But this time, she did not stay silent. She came in, closed the door, and said, "I found something." I motioned for her to sit down. She placed the folder in front of me and showed me a payment sequence that looked suspiciously familiar. Another overpayment. Another duplicated account. Another attempt to hide money inside a clean-looking line item. I checked the trail. Then I looked at her. "This is good work," I said. She blinked. "I thought you'd be mad." "Why would I be mad?" "Because I was scared to bring it up to anyone else." I leaned back in my chair and smiled a little. "Then you brought it to the right person." That was the moment I knew the company had started to change in a real way. Not because a policy was written, not because a headline was published, but because someone who once would have stayed silent finally spoke. That is how repair begins. Not loudly, not perfectly, just one brave moment at a time. A year later, the settlement with the company was finalized. Richard was facing criminal charges and civil action. Several other people were removed from their positions. The financial losses were recovered in pieces. Not all of it, but enough to keep the company stable and force long-term reform. People asked me whether I felt satisfied. I never knew how to answer that question. Satisfied is not the right word. Relieved, maybe. Strengthened, yes. Healed. Slowly. But satisfied? No. Because there are some things that do not become okay just because the truth wins. You do not get your lost time back. You do not get your reputation back exactly as it was. You do not get to forget the nights you spent crying into your pillow wondering if life would ever treat you fairly again. But you do get something else. You get your name back. And your name matters more than people think. One evening, after a long day at work, I went to visit my mother. She had tea ready when I arrived. She was sitting by the window, wrapped in her sweater, watching the rain fall. When she saw me, she smiled the way mothers do when they are proud but try not to show it too much. She said, "You look tired." I laughed softly. "I am tired." She patted the chair beside her, and I sat down. For a while, we said nothing. Then she turned to me and asked, "Do you still think about that day?" I knew exactly which day she meant. The day I came home with the cardboard box. The day my world fell apart. I nodded. "Sometimes." She reached over and touched my hand. "I used to think strength meant never falling down," she said. "Now I know strength is getting back up without letting the fall define you." I looked at her and felt tears rise unexpectedly. That sentence stayed with me, because that was the truth of my life. Richard had tried to define me with one lie. A lie that said I was a thief. A lie that said I was disposable. A lie that said I was small. But I was none of those things. I was a woman who had been wounded and kept walking. And that is the kind of strength no lie can erase. Years later, people still ask me how I found the courage to return to that company. I always tell them the same thing. I did not return because I was fearless. I returned because I was done being powerless. There is a difference. Fearless people are rare. But people who decide not to live under a lie? There are more of us than anyone realizes. You just have to survive long enough to meet them. Today, my office wall holds a framed copy of the company's new ethics policy. It sounds boring. Maybe it is. But for me, it is proof. Proof that systems can change. Proof that one voice can force a room to listen. Proof that the woman who was once escorted out like a criminal came back as the person everyone had to answer to. Sometimes I stand by the window in my office and look at the city below. The traffic moves. People hurry. Phones ring. Life goes on. And I think about all the people out there who've been blamed for things they did not do. People who are still too afraid to speak. People who have been told to stay quiet, move on, and be grateful they still have something left. I wish I could sit with every one of them and tell them this. You are not crazy. You are not weak. And being treated like the guilty one does not make you guilty. Truth has a way of waiting. Sometimes it waits years. Sometimes it waits until you are ready. Sometimes it waits until you walk back into the same room with a different name, a different voice, and a different kind of strength. And when it finally arrives, it does not always shout. Sometimes it simply opens the door and lets the whole room see what was there all along. That is what happened to me. I was fired for a theft I did not commit. I was humiliated, erased, and nearly broken. Richard never spoke to me again after that. Not directly, anyway. There were legal notices, statements through lawyers, denials that grew weaker every time new evidence came out. His confidence, the same confidence that once made him look untouchable, began to collapse piece by piece. But I did not watch his downfall out of pleasure. I watched it because I needed to make sure it was real. For too long he had lived in a world where truth could be delayed, twisted, buried, or bought. He had counted on that. He had counted on me being too poor, too alone, and too frightened to fight back. That was his biggest mistake. He thought pain would make me silent forever. He did not understand that pain can also make a person sharper. A month after the final internal report was released, the company held a formal public apology event. Lawyers wanted polished language. The board wanted to move forward. Daniel wanted accountability that actually meant something. I only agreed to attend because I knew how much it would matter to the employees who had watched everything happen and still had to come to work every morning. The room was full. Again. But this time, I was not standing in the back. This time, I was seated at the front table. That alone felt like a different life. The statement was read first. The company admitted that I had been wrongfully accused and wrongfully terminated. It admitted that Richard had used false records to frame me while hiding internal theft. It admitted that leadership failures had allowed the fraud to continue. The words were careful, but they were there. Truth does not need to be beautiful to matter. When it was my turn to speak, I stood slowly. The room went quiet. I looked at the faces in front of me. Some were old, some were new. Some had once believed the worst about me. Some had not known what to believe. And some had looked away because looking away was easier than asking hard questions. I did not blame all of them, not equally, but I needed them to hear me. So I said, I was fired in this building for a crime I did not commit. I lost my job, my stability, my reputation, and almost my sense of self. I spent years rebuilding what one lie tried to destroy. I paused. Please understand something very clearly. Silence is not neutral. When people see something wrong and stay quiet, they are not outside the problem. They are helping it grow. No one moved. I kept going. I am not here to shame the people who were afraid. I am here to remind everyone that fear does not excuse cruelty, and convenience does not excuse betrayal. My voice was calm, but every word was heavy. Then I added, I came back to this company because I wanted the truth, not revenge. Truth. Because a company that can destroy an innocent person and keep going is a company that has lost its soul. That line hit harder than I expected. I saw heads lower. I saw a few people cry. I saw one older woman in the second row press her lips together like she was trying to hold herself together. And for the first time, I felt something that was not anger and not grief. I felt release. Not complete. Not perfect. But enough. After the event, several employees came up to me privately. Some apologized. Some thanked me. One young man from accounting told me quietly, I thought I noticed something wrong last year, but I kept telling myself someone above me would handle it. I looked at him and answered, next time, don't wait for someone above you. He nodded immediately. Another woman said she had saved one of my old emails years ago because she believed I sounded too careful to be guilty. That nearly made me cry, because sometimes the smallest act of quiet belief is the thing that keeps a person alive. Not long after that, Daniel asked me if I would help design the company's new internal integrity program. I said yes. It was not glamorous work. There were policies to write, safeguards to build, audit systems to redesign, whistleblower protections to strengthen, review chains to shorten, access controls to tighten, training modules to create. But I loved it. Because every rule we fixed was a door Richard would no longer be able to open. Every safeguard was a wall built around someone else's future. Every check we installed was a message to the next liar who thought the system would protect them. It would not. Not anymore. Sometimes I stayed late in the office after everyone left. The building had the same quiet hum at night, but I no longer feared it. I would walk past the glass hallways and remember who I had been when I first came here. Young, hopeful, careful, easy to blame. Then I would look at my reflection in the dark window and see the woman I had become. Not hard, just stronger. Not cold, just clear. One evening, as I was leaving, Jenna caught up to me in the lobby. She looked less frightened than she used to. That made me smile. She stood there for a moment and said, I just wanted to tell you something. I waited. She took a breath. Because of you, I reported something last week. A small thing, but I reported it. I studied her face and said, good. She smiled nervously. I was scared. I know. But I did it anyway. I nodded. That's how it starts. She looked relieved, as if she had needed permission to believe she had done the right thing. Maybe she had. Maybe we all do sometimes. The truth is, there are people who will never understand what it costs to tell the truth in a place built on fear. They will ask why you waited, why you did not fight sooner, why you were quiet, why you let it happen. But they were not there. They were not standing in the hallway with security watching them carry their belongings in a cardboard box. They were not being cut off from jobs, friends, and dignity in one afternoon. They were not trying to survive on the other side of a lie that had already been made public. So I stopped explaining myself to people who only wanted the clean version of a messy wound. I started speaking only to the truth. That changed everything. My mother noticed it first. She said I stood differently now, less folded inward, more present. She was right. For years, I had walked like someone trying not to take up too much space. Now I walked like someone who had earned every inch of it. One Sunday, we sat together at her kitchen table with tea and fresh bread. She looked at me for a long time before speaking. Then she said, I knew you would come back. I smiled softly. Did you? She nodded. I didn't know when, but I knew you would not stay broken. I looked down at my tea because I could feel tears building again. She reached over and touched my hand. You were always stronger than they were, she said. You just had to learn it yourself. That was the kind of sentence that stays in a person forever, because it gives you back the years you spent doubting your own worth. It gives you back your name. It gives you back the version of yourself that existed before humiliation tried to rewrite her. Years later, people would tell this story in different ways. Some would call it a comeback. Some would call it justice. Some would call it a corporate scandal. But I know what it really was. It was one woman refusing to let a lie become permanent. It was a thief finally being seen for what he was. It was a company forced to face the damage it had allowed. And it was a quiet girl with a cardboard box returning as a woman with proof. That is what I think about most when I remember walking through those doors again. Not the money, not the board meeting, not even Richard's face when the truth finally cornered him. I think about the moment I first stepped into that building years earlier, full of hope, believing that doing the right thing was enough to protect me. I was wrong. Doing the right thing does not always protect you. Sometimes it costs you everything first. But even then, it still matters. Maybe especially then. Because when the dust settles, when the lies fall apart, when the people who looked untouchable are finally exposed, the truth remains. And the truth is the one thing they could never take from me forever. Richard's last mistake was thinking he could still control the room even after everything had fallen apart. He had spent too many years believing power meant being louder than everyone else. But power is not volume. Power is what remains when the lies stop working. A few weeks after the public apology, the investigators uncovered one final layer of his scheme. It was worse than we first thought. The money theft was only part of it. He had also been quietly pushing out anyone who questioned him. Good workers. Honest workers. People who noticed missing funds, strange invoices, and approvals that made no sense. He built a little kingdom out of fear, and because people were afraid to challenge him, he kept expanding it. When the final report came back, Daniel called me into his office again. He looked tired that day. Not angry, not shocked. Just tired in the way only honest people become when they have to clean up a mess someone else made. He handed me the report and said, "You were right about all of it." I nodded once. That should have felt satisfying. Instead, it felt heavy. Because being right about evil is not a victory anyone enjoys. It only means you saw too much. Daniel leaned back in his chair and asked, "What do you want done next?" I looked at him for a moment. That question mattered more than he knew. Years ago, no one had asked me what I wanted. They had decided for me. They decided I was guilty. They decided I was disposable. They decided my voice was less important than his reputation. Now I had the chance to decide something for myself. So I said, "I want the company to protect the next person before they have to survive what I survived." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say." That was the beginning of the full internal reform. It sounds simple when I say it now. It was not simple. It meant changing the way people reported issues. It meant creating real checks instead of fake ones. It meant making sure no manager could bury complaints. It meant giving employees a safe channel to speak without fear of retaliation. It meant building a system where one powerful person could no longer hide inside everybody else's silence. I spent months helping build that system, and every time we closed a loophole, I thought about Richard. Not because I missed him, because I wanted to understand him. People like him do not start out as monsters. That is what makes them so dangerous. They begin as charming, as convincing, as helpful, as the person who says, "Leave it to me." Then one day, you realize he has been taking pieces from everyone around him, and he has built a life out of what other people lost. That was Richard. A man who stole and blamed. A man who lied and smiled. A man who used my name like a trash bag to carry his own guilt out of the room. The investigators eventually brought me in to testify again. This time not privately. Formally, there was a hearing. A real one. Not a boardroom meeting. Not a quiet review. Not a whispered conversation in the hallway. This was official. Paperwork, recordings, transcripts, legal teams, and everyone finally forced to sit still long enough to listen. Richard's lawyer tried to make it sound complicated. He used words like misunderstanding, internal confusion, administrative error. I listened to all of it without moving. Then they asked me to speak. I stood up. The room was quiet enough to hear a pen fall. I looked straight ahead and said, I did not steal anything from that company. I was framed by my manager after I found financial irregularities that pointed back to him. I reported concerns in good faith, and instead of being protected, I was punished. My voice stayed steady. I lost my job. I lost my reputation. I lost years of my life trying to recover from a lie that was easier for other people to believe than the truth. I paused. Then I said the part I had waited years to say. I was not fired because I was guilty. I was fired because I was useful as a scapegoat. That line landed hard. I saw one of the attorneys look down at his notes. I saw a board member blink like he had just been slapped awake. Richard sat at the table with both hands folded in front of him. He did not look at me. He stared at the desk as if looking down hard enough might make him disappear. The lawyer asked if I had anything else to add. I did. So I said, the worst part was not losing the job. The worst part was the silence afterward. The silence told me that the people with the most power cared more about protecting the company image than protecting the truth. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, but I am standing here now because silence does not get the final word. No one interrupted me. No one argued. Because at that point, they all knew. The evidence was overwhelming. The records matched. The transfer trail matched. The emails matched. The timing matched. Everything matched. Even Richard's own words from old messages came back to destroy him. The hearing ended later that afternoon. When I walked out into the hallway, the air felt different. Not lighter, not magical, just real. A reporter was waiting outside the building. I had not expected that. Daniel must have known the story would get out. These things always do eventually. The reporter asked, Miss Bennett, how does it feel to return to the company that fired you? I stopped walking. For a second, I thought about saying something polished, something safe, something that sounded good on television. But that was not my truth. So I answered honestly. It feels like survival, I said. It feels like telling the truth long enough for it to become undeniable. The reporter asked another question. Do you feel vindicated? I looked past the cameras, past the lights, past the building where all of it happened. Then I said, I feel free. That was the closest thing to victory I had ever said out loud. And it was enough. The article that followed was everywhere for a while. Some people called me brave. Some called me lucky. Some said it was inspiring. I did not care about the labels. People always need to turn pain into a headline. But what mattered to me was not the attention. What mattered was that the story was now public. The lie had lost its shelter. That changed everything. The old employees who had been too scared to speak started coming forward. One by one, quietly at first, then more confidently. A finance clerk admitted she had noticed suspicious entries years ago but had been told not to dig too deep. A junior analyst said Richard had regularly blamed other team members for errors he made himself. A former assistant said he used intimidation to keep people obedient. A warehouse supervisor said missing inventory reports had been altered before they reached upper management. They all carried the same look when they came forward. The look of people who had lived too long with the weight of something they should not have had to carry. I never treated them like cowards. I knew fear too well for that. Fear is powerful. Fear can make good people freeze. It can make them wait. It can make them hope someone else will be the first one to speak. Sometimes I wanted to ask, Why didn't you say something sooner? But I already knew the answer. Because saying something can cost you everything in a place run by people like Richard. So instead, I listened. And I made sure they were heard. That mattered. Because healing is not just about punishment. It is also about restoring dignity to the people who were silenced. One night, after a long week, I stayed late in the office again. The building was quiet. The lights were dim. The city outside glowed through the glass. I sat alone in my office and thought about the first day I had ever walked into that company. Back then, I believed success was simple. Work hard. Be honest. Be useful. Stay kind. I still believe in kindness. But now I know kindness without boundaries can be used against you. Honesty without protection can make you a target. Hard work without fairness can become someone else's tool. That is a hard lesson, but it is also a true one. I took out one of the old files from my desk drawer. Not the legal one, not the financial one. A small one. Inside was a copy of the termination notice from 5 years ago. I had kept it all this time. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I placed it in the shredder. The paper disappeared in silence. And somehow that felt bigger than any speech I had ever given. Because I was no longer carrying that version of me. The one who had been dragged out. The one who had been embarrassed. The one who had begged reality to make sense. She had served her time inside my chest. Now she was gone. Not erased. Released. A few months later, the company invited me to speak at a training session for new employees. I almost said no. Speaking publicly had never been comfortable for me. But Daniel said something I still remember. He said, "You don't have to tell your story to relive it. You can tell it to stop it from happening again." So I went. The room was full of new hires. Young faces. Nervous faces. Hopeful faces. Faces that still believed work would always reward honesty. I stood at the front with my notes in hand and looked at them for a long second. Then I said, "I want to tell you a story." The room went still. I once worked in this company and believed my job was to keep things running smoothly. I thought if I did my work carefully and stayed out of trouble, I would be safe. I was wrong. I saw some of them lean in. I found theft. I reported it. And instead of being protected, I was framed and fired. A few people looked shocked. I kept going.